Cruising has always felt like one of the easiest holidays you can take. You book it, you show up, and everything just works. But right now, there are some pretty big things happening in the world, and they're starting to quietly affect how cruises operate. You might not hear cruise lines talk about it directly, but behind the scenes, routes are being adjusted, prices are shifting, and certain destinations aren't as straightforward as they used to be. And most passengers don't even realize why. It's not something you'll see when you're relaxing by the pool or heading to dinner, but it does show up in your itinerary, your costs, and sometimes even your overall experience. So if you're planning a cruise in 2026, there are a few important changes you need to understand first, because cruising isn't exactly the same as it was, and the people who know what's going on early are the ones who have the best trips. Number 1, fuel prices are becoming unpredictable, and that's quietly changing the cost of cruising. Now, this is something most people never think about, but cruise ships use a huge amount of fuel every single day. And right now, with everything happening around major oil-producing regions and key shipping routes, fuel prices can jump very quickly. Even small changes globally can push those costs up. And when that happens, cruise lines don't just absorb it. Instead, you'll start to notice things like higher cruise fares, fewer cheap deals, and sometimes even small extra charges that weren't there before. In some cases, it's not even obvious. The price just feels higher than it used to, and you can't quite figure out why. But behind the scenes, fuel is one of the biggest reasons, and here's the part a lot of people miss. When fuel becomes less predictable, cruise lines also become more cautious about where they send their ships. So it's not just about price. It can also influence routes, itineraries, and even how long your cruise spends at sea. Which means this one change doesn't just affect your wallet, it can quietly shape your entire cruise experience. Number 2. Some cruise routes are already being adjusted, and most passengers don't realize why. Cruise ships don't just randomly sail around the ocean. They follow very specific global routes that have been used for years. But when certain areas of the world become less stable or more unpredictable, cruise lines start making quiet changes. And that can mean avoiding certain regions altogether, even if they were popular cruise destinations before. Now, you won't always see a big announcement about this. Instead, what happens is, your itinerary might look slightly different, or a cruise you were planning suddenly isn't being offered anymore. Sometimes ports get replaced. Sometimes entire routes disappear for a while. And from a passenger point of view, it just feels like a normal change. Nothing too unusual. But behind the scenes, those decisions are often being made because cruise lines are choosing safer, more predictable paths for their ships, which means the cruise options available to you may not be exactly the same as they were even a year or two ago. Number 3. Cruises may start taking longer routes, and that can change your itinerary more than you expect. If cruise lines decide to avoid certain areas, ships don't just cancel the trip, they reroute. And that can mean sailing further out, taking a different path, or completely shifting how the cruise is structured. Now on paper, your cruise might still be listed as the same number of days. But behind the scenes, more time is being spent getting from place to place, which can lead to fewer ports, shorter stops, or more sea days added into your itinerary. And sometimes, you won't even realize this has happened unless you compare it to older versions of the same cruise. It just feels like you're spending a bit more time at sea than you expected. But that's often because the ship is taking a longer, more cautious route. And just like fuel costs, this doesn't only affect where you go. It shapes the entire rhythm of your cruise, how often you stop, how long you explore, and how much time you actually spend off the ship. Number 4. Insurance costs for cruise ships are rising, and that quietly affects what you pay. This is one of those behind-the-scenes factors that cruise lines never really talk about. But when certain parts of the world become less predictable, the cost to insure a massive cruise ship goes up, sometimes significantly. And we're not talking small amounts here. These are huge vessels carrying thousands of passengers, so any increase in risk means higher premiums for cruise companies. Now, they don't come out and say, your cruise is more expensive because of insurance, but the cost has to go somewhere. So you might start to see higher fares, stricter booking conditions, or fewer flexible cancellation options than before. And sometimes it shows up in smaller ways too, like reduced perks, fewer inclusions, or changes to what used to be standard. It's subtle, but it's there. And it's another example of how global events that feel far away can still end up shaping your cruise in ways most people never even think about. Before we continue, if you're getting value out of this video so far, make sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already, and drop a comment saying, "Cruise for you." I'd love to personally thank you for supporting the channel. Number 5. Getting to your cruise is becoming more complicated, even if the cruise itself hasn't changed. A lot of people focus on the ship, but forget that most cruises start with a flight. And right now, with certain parts of the world becoming more restricted or sensitive for air travel, flight paths are starting to change. Planes may need to take longer routes, avoid certain areas, or deal with more congestion in the skies. And that can lead to delays, higher ticket prices, or less reliable connections. So even if your cruise itinerary looks perfectly normal, actually getting to the departure port can be a lot less predictable than it used to be. And this is where people get caught out. Flights run late, connections get tight, and suddenly you're at risk of missing your cruise altogether. Which is why more experienced cruisers are now arriving a day earlier than they used to, just to give themselves that buffer. Because right now, it's not just the cruise you need to think about, it's the journey to the cruise as well. Number 6. Ports can be swapped or skipped much faster than before, sometimes at the last minute. Cruise itineraries used to feel pretty locked in. Once you booked it, that was your route. But now, cruise lines are watching global conditions much more closely, and they're ready to make changes quickly if needed. That means a port you were really looking forward to might get replaced or skipped altogether. And sometimes, it happens just weeks before sailing, or even while you're already on board. Now usually, cruise lines will substitute another destination, but it's not always equal to what you originally booked. And this is where expectations can get a bit tricky, because from the cruise line's point of view, they're making the safest and most practical decision. But from a passenger's point of view, it can feel like the trip you planned isn't quite the same anymore. And this is becoming more common. Not because cruise lines want to change things, but because they're reacting faster to what's happening globally in real time. Number 7. Cruise prices may start to feel more unpredictable than they used to. In the past, cruise pricing followed a pretty familiar pattern. Book early for the best deal, or wait for a last-minute bargain. But now, with so many moving parts in the background, fuel, routes, insurance, and overall demand, pricing isn't as steady as it once was. You might see a cruise jump in price much faster than expected, or two very similar cruises priced completely differently. And sometimes, those cheap last-minute deals just don't appear at all, because cruise lines are factoring in more uncertainty and building that into their pricing from the start. So instead of clear patterns, it can feel a bit unpredictable. And this is where people get caught out. They wait, expecting prices to drop like they used to, and instead, they go up, which means timing your booking is becoming less about following the old rules and more about recognizing when a good price is actually worth locking in. Number 8. You may start noticing more small charges and fewer inclusions on board. Instead of one big price jump, cruise lines often spread the cost in smaller ways. So rather than clearly increasing fares, they might start adjusting what's included and what isn't. Things that used to feel standard, like certain dining options, room extras, or onboard perks, may slowly shift into paid add-ons. And it's subtle. You don't always notice it straight away, but by the end of the cruise, you've spent more than you expected. A lot of this comes down to rising operating costs behind the scenes. When things like fuel, logistics, and overall expenses become less predictable, cruise lines look for ways to balance that without making it too obvious up front. So instead of one big change, you get lots of small ones. And for passengers, that means it's becoming more important to look closely at what's actually included in your cruise, not just the headline price, because what looks like a good deal at first might not include as much as it used to. Number 9. Security and boarding procedures are becoming more noticeable. Now, this isn't about anything dramatic, but you may start to feel a difference compared to a few years ago. With everything happening globally, cruise lines and ports are being a bit more cautious when it comes to passenger processing and safety checks. That can mean longer check-in times, more detailed document checks, or slightly tighter screening before you board. And sometimes, it's not just at the cruise terminal. It can also show up at the ports you visit along the way. Most of the time, it just feels like things are moving a bit slower, or a bit more structured than before. But it's all part of cruise lines adjusting to a world that's a little less predictable. And while it might add a bit of time at the start of your trip, it's one of those changes that's quietly becoming part of the new normal for cruising. Number 10. Cruising is shifting from fixed plans to flexible travel. And this is the biggest change of all. For years, cruising was one of the most predictable holidays you could take. You booked your itinerary, and you expected to get exactly that: the same ports, the same timing, the same experience. But with everything happening globally right now, cruise lines are operating a little differently. They're planning for changes, building in backup options, and making decisions much faster than they used to. Which means, as a passenger, flexibility is becoming part of the deal. Your cruise might still be amazing. In fact, most still are. But it might not look exactly like what you originally booked. And this is where mindset becomes really important. Because the people who go in expecting everything to be perfectly fixed are the ones who end up frustrated. But the ones who understand how things are changing and go in a bit more flexible are usually the ones who still have an incredible time. So cruising isn't necessarily getting worse, it's just becoming different. And the sooner you understand that, the better your cruise experience is going to be.